The Star of Panadur by Albert Pina and Henry Hasse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by the Atomic Dragons of Mars. The Star of Panadur by Albert Pina and Henry Hasse. On the barren wastes of Europa, two marooned men fought, battling over an animal whose life one had saved. There was no fear in the animal's eyes, only the gleam of a weird, unearthly knowledge that foretold the way the fight would end.
Hugh, there's life here. Look at this. Found it in a cavern.
The shrill voice was exultant and gleeful. Hugh Betancourt quickly rose from the fire he tended and turned startled eyes on the furry bundle Jim Brannigan grasped firmly by the scruff of its neck. At first, nothing was visible but the liquid sheen of the thing's silvery fur. But as Jim roughly thrust it out, Hugh gave an involuntary gasp of surprise. The creature's small, triangular face was nothing less than beautiful. Its eyes were soft and large and luminous, like barrels set wide apart. Above its broad forehead was a short mane of silver fur, beginning in a widow's peak, fell back cloud soft and shimmering. It was about 3 feet tall, slim, furred to the throat line, a strange biped with slender arms and 6-fingered hands.
Damn it, Jim, go easy. You've all but strangled it. Here, give it to me.
Hugh extended his arms.
Don't let it get away from you. It's faster than a jackrabbit, Jim cautioned, extending the ham-sized hand in which he held the creature. Luckily, I surprised it in a sort of cave-like gully where it couldn't escape. It means food, Hugh. Lots of food, if we can find more of these animals.
For a moment, the incipient madness of many days on this hellish satellite engulfed Hugh in a wave of nausea. He remembered the gravity screen tearing from its pivots, and the spaceship caught in the tremendous pull of Jupiter, the last desperate try at the controls, and then the tiny dark bulk of Europa curving up to meet them headlong. There had been cheerless days of biting cold when the tiny satellite faced the distant pallid sun. There had been nights that were like a canto out of Dante as they were bathed in Jupiter's red, cold glow. More recently, and for more reason, Hugh remembered the dwindling food supply, which had now quite vanished.
Yes, food,
Hugh echoed Jim's words in a hoarse whisper. He grasped the soft, warm body in his hands with gentle firmness. The creature did not try to escape. It lay limp and inert, with its eyes closed.
But food doesn't quite solve our problem. Unless we can find some oxide crystal to alloy in the portable smelter, we're sunk. Jim, that jagged hole in the prow isn't going to repair itself.
Jim's ordinarily red face grew redder with anger, until there was no distinguishing between the color of his hair and that of his face.
All right, he snarled, so we need the oxide. For days we've been searching all over this cold hell for some, and where are we? I still maintain our immediate problem is food.
Yes, food, Hugh murmured. Why, he wondered vaguely, was he so reluctant to talk about it while he held this limp, warm creature in his arms? He looked down at it again, and was startled to find himself staring into its extraordinary eyes, limpid, brilliant, full of a semi-human intelligence now. They were scarcely a foot from Hugh's own eyes, and for a single instant Hugh had the crazy idea that they were filled with a strange fixity of purpose, almost as if they were trying to convey something to him there in the appalling silence of Europa. A sudden cold came over Hugh that was not the cold of Europa. It took quite an effort for him to tear his own eyes away. Then he laughed and whispered inquiringly of himself, "Am I going crazy? Maybe this place is beginning to get me at last. For a moment I thought..." He shrugged uneasily. "What are you mumbling?" Jim demanded irritably, his huge form bulking against the bizarre, jagged landscape. "I'd have slit that thing's throat and skinned it already. Here, give it..." "Wait, you fool!" Hugh's ordinarily thoughtful hazel eyes were bright now and hard as he drew back from Jim's grasping hand. "We're the first to find life on Europa, the only ones to see what inhabits it, and all you think about is your damn stomach. You can't be starved. You ate this morning." "Yes, and that was the last of it," Jim snarled. His face was ugly now, and purposeful. "Well, I'm hungry again, and now that I've found these European kangaroos, I aim to be fed and kept warm. Notice how fine that pelt is?" Hugh had noticed indeed. He had noticed even more the peculiar sheen and aliveness of it, as if it were surcharged with a definite energy. As he held the creature close, a warm feeling of well-being slowly diffused through him, and something like a faint echo in his brain was like a shadowy background to his thoughts. Yes, he knew here was food, and here was warm fur against the eternal cold of the satellite. But their spacesuits protected them in a measure against the cold, and, if necessary, they could subsist a few more days without eating. Perhaps by then they would find some of the rare crystal oxide, enough to repair the ship and leave. Perhaps. It was a long chance, almost an impossibility, and Hugh knew it. But now, also, he knew what he must do. He did it. With a distasteful glance at his now openly belligerent partner, he stepped forward. Then, with unexpected suddenness, he lurched as if he'd lost his footing on the rough terrain. He stumbled sideways. He twisted and fell deliberately to the ground. He opened his arms wide. It was rather clumsily done, Hugh realized that instantly. For an infinitesimal moment, the furry creature sprawled too, immobile, where Hugh's momentum had flung it. It gazed with an uncanny intensity into the Earthman's eyes. Then, in a single graceful leap of incredible speed, it was gone into the growing red haze, as night came on and Jupiter's macabre glow shattered the surrounding crags. "You fool! You utter damned fool!" Jim Brannigan screamed, livid with rage. "You did that deliberately!" Then his huge body was launching at Hugh, the great heavy fists lashing out with the force of pistons. Hugh, lighter but more lithe, had only time to roll to one side and regain his feet. Then he was ducking the barrage of blows, evading the murderous rushes, allowing Jim to tire out his frantic rage. Only once did Hugh strike a blow, a terrific lashing left into the other's solar plexus that doubled the red giant into helpless nausea. "That's all we need now," Hugh said with a measure of calm. "To maim or cripple each other. We'll never get back that way. Come out of it, man. What we've got to do is get that oxide." "What we've got to get is food. You let the only food go that we had." Jim Brannigan began to weep in great, racking sobs. Merely nerves. Temporary hysterical reaction, Hugh decided. Jim wasn't really hungry yet. He was only anticipating the event. When he got over this, he would sulk. When he got over that, he would start scheming with that unpredictable mind of his. Knowing the man, Hugh decided to watch him carefully from now on. He took Jim's arm, and they walked over to the crippled spacer, lying like a great silver bug with its nose smashed in the stark hollow of this ravine. They entered. Hugh walked forward and examined the thin sheet of beryllium that patched the ship's wounded hull for the night. He went astern and turned on the generators at quarter speed to provide a miserly warmth. On his way back to the inner cabin, he stopped and peered out of a porthole at a now familiar scene. Europa's dark, mad terrain becoming swiftly suffused with Jupiter's red. He entered the cabin, glanced at Jim, and saw that he was now in the sulking stage. The hunger problem pressed insistently upon Hugh's own mind. That little furry creature. In spite of hunger, he was still glad he had let it escape, but, damn it, he wished he knew why. Hugh thrust the problem from him and glanced again at Jim. Soon, Jim's mind, bordering upon necessity, would begin scheming. Hugh knew the man. Despite an utter weariness, Hugh didn't sleep through the rest of that short night. His mind, alert and hunger clear, wrestled with the problem of survival in this mad world of snow and silence. In the opposite beryllium mesh bunk, Jim snored fitfully, as though rehearsing in his sleep some violence in his mind. Hugh arose slowly and donned with caution the stiff, heavy spacesuit as protection against the cold. Adjusting the helmet and oxygen tank, he opened the airlock and ventured out into the Dantesque magnificence of Europa's night. The red opaline haze had the quality of a waking nightmare. The great snow crystals were drifting lazily again, appearing now like livid blotches of ruby. Jupiter loomed like a great gloating nemesis across the entire ragged horizon. Hugh didn't know where he was going. No predetermined plan guided his footsteps. There was only a great urgency to leave the spacer and go somewhere and seek. Hugh stopped, brushed the brittle red snow from his faceplate, and wished he could wipe the sweat from his brow. Go where and seek what? Seek oxide crystals, of course, he told himself. But there was something else now, something strange and powerful that gripped a part of his mind and urged him on like the fear of madness. He stumbled on for hours, it seemed, until he was in the fearsome cavern country. Here the stark, heaven-rearing cliffs were honeycombed with tortuous caves and gullies and immense grottos. He entered a low gallery-like cave that wound in and downward into the mass of a gigantic cliff. Now an unshakable inner dread plucked at his mind and gripped his throat as he tried to check his precipitate descent, but couldn't. He no longer seemed possessed of any volition of his own. He shrugged fatalistically. Then he felt a thrill of excitement as he noticed a faint luminescence of the surrounding walls. This light increased as he descended deeper and deeper through widening passages. Then, at last, at the end of a turn, a burst of radiance met his eyes. He was in a grotto of titanic proportions. The substance of its walls and distant ceiling gave it the gentle radiance of a sunless day. But it was a glaucous radiance, ineffably green as the light beneath the waters of a shallow sea. "Holy roaring comets!" Hugh swore aloud as he stood there quite still, staring. "By all the red tails on Venus, it's oxide! All of it!" His voice echoed inside his helmet and beat against his eardrums. Yes, it was beryllium oxide, gleaming at his feet, crystalline and powdery, just as men had found it for the first time a century before in the desert wastes of Arizona. The entire floor of the grotto was covered with it as far as his widening eyes could see. He bent in a frenzy of joy and scooped up whole handfuls. He half babbled over it like a delirious King Midas. He let it trickle fondly through his fingers in a little glittering flood. Saved! Now they could repair the ship and return to Earth and tell of this. Not until several minutes later did Hugh begin to wonder how he had come here. With a rush of apprehension, he remembered a cold and tenacious something that had seized a part of his mind. But now it was gone, and he felt strangely limp and tired. He leaped to his feet. Staring around, he wondered if he could retrace his steps back to the spaceship. And in that precise moment he felt his mind seized again with a sort of frantic suddenness. There was no mistaking that very clear warning of danger, danger. But he could not have acted in time. Even as he spun around, he was unaware of the shadow that lengthened behind him until it loomed very near, and a part of it lashed out. Not until the last split second did Hugh glimpse wild and red-streaked eyes in vivid contrast to the grim and purposeful face behind a helmet plate. Then the part of the shadow that was Jim Brannigan's arm, holding something massive like a rock, completed the swift arc and struck. A sun exploded within Hugh's head. Livid flames engulfed him, consumed him. He tried to cry out, but couldn't. Then the sun fragments cruelly withdrew, leaving him helpless in a cold blackness through which he fell like a plummet to ultimate extinction. Jim Brannigan stood there tensely for a moment, looking at the man he had struck down. But only for a moment. His lips quirked into a tight smile, and his exulting keen eyes took in the cave's glittering expanse. "A fortune in oxide crystals," he murmured. "An inexhaustible mine. And he thought he could cheat me out of it? Keep it from me? Good thing I followed him. Serves him right if I've killed him." He didn't seem too worried about it, and he didn't look at Hugh's body again as he started gathering in the rare crystals. "Europa's uncharted. I can claim deed this whole region, and probably there's another fortune in furs," he added as he suddenly remembered the creature he had captured. Already, in his greedy mind's eye, he saw himself a tycoon, the Oxide King, with a corner on furs finer than anything ever seen on Earth, Venus, or Mars. This he saw. But what he didn't see were the myriad pairs of burning beryl eyes peering at him from concealed openings in the opaline walls. He was not aware of the increasing energy potential being generated by a growing legion of furred bodies in surrounding caverns, as more and more Panadurs pressed forward to peer out at him. Around Jim Brannigan now the frigid atmosphere began to rise. At first it was pleasantly cool, then warm and warmer, until it became suffocating. Still, the silvery-furred Panadurs, in utter silence, generated heat as their mental forces grew and deliberately united into a single increasing potential. Their fur stood erect, an angry violet silver now, crackling a little with the intensity of the effort. As a single unit they waited, each furry Panadur now touching the other in a living, livid chain of cumulative power. Jim Brannigan ceased his gloating, and awoke at last to an indefinable danger. Swiftly he arose and whirled towards the entrance, peering back over his shoulder at the danger he could feel, that he knew was there, but he could not see. But already it was too late. Now that increasing energy potential, grown and united into a single purposeful weapon, was being aimed. Jim Brannigan hadn't taken 3 steps toward the entrance when suddenly, silently, intangible as thought, but infinitely more devastating, it was released. As the devastating bolt struck him, Brannigan collapsed into a crumpled heap, shattered, silent, inert. For hours that lengthened into days, Hugh Betancourt lay unconscious. His blanched features were lifeless and cold, there in the same cavern where Brannigan's treacherous blow had toppled him into oblivion. Then, as a hint of color returned to his cheeks, and a slow strength began to course through his limbs, he regained moments of lucidness. But they were brief, and he always lapsed back into delirium. With the wavering unreality of a mirage, vague memories of those strange furred creatures encircling him surged into his mind. They seemed to have pressed close to him, holding hands. Strange! They were joined by a line of their fellow Panadurs to a similar circle, surrounding a huddled figure a short distance away. But that was crazy, and Hugh's mind would slide back into the darkness again. Once he thought one of the Panadurs came and placed its exquisite face against his chest, and held it there for a long time, as if he were testing the Earthman's metabolism. This seemed so very real. Hugh was aware of an almost crackling silence and the cave ceiling's unchanging luminescence. Still, a third time, he imagined that a silver-gray Panadur, almost stately in his measured movements, came over to him with a gleaming jewel in his hand. It was an inch in diameter and the same color as the creature's eyes, a pale, lucent green. Majestically, despite his diminutive size, he placed the stone over Hugh's heart. Instantly the gem flamed with the effulgence of a glowing star. The Panadur seemed satisfied. When, at last, Hugh Betancourt regained full consciousness and was able to sit up and stare around him, he realized that he had not been a prey to delusions. Although he still felt weak, his mind was crystal clear. Here was the circle of Panadurs still enclosing him, but the circle had grown, as if a great many more creatures had joined the uncanny circle in an ecstasy to be in close proximity to the tall Earthman. Their furry, vibrating bodies pressed close to him, and their strange, fragile hands touched his wrists and throat and face as they seemed to caress him with infinite gentleness. Waves of sheer energy seemed to envelop him and penetrate to the deepest recesses of his being. As if by some strange alchemy, these alien creatures of stark Europa were transmitting to him the elemental life force itself. But strangely enough, that other circle of Panadurs enclosing that huddled figure over there in the semi-gloom was contracting as it grew smaller and smaller, day by day. Hugh ceased to wonder about all this as he lay back to gather his strength. He fell into a peaceful sleep. This time, when he awoke, it was to a profound sense of well-being, far beyond anything he'd ever known. It permeated his body with the exhilarating glow of a rare Venusian wine. One thing, however, still eluded him. He sat up and felt his head where the blow had fallen. He remembered only the excruciating pain in the microscopic instant before the rushing darkness came. There was nothing there now, not even a scar. A rock from the ceiling must have fallen, he thought. My luck to be standing right under it. It was not a rock. The thought came into his mind, clear and unmistakable. Then Hugh found himself staring into the beryl green eyes of the stately keeper of the jewel. Like a flash, the scene he had not witnessed, of Brannigan stalking him from the spaceship, the murderous blow, and the vision of himself lying in a pool of blood on the glittering expanse of oxide crystals, was etched into his mind by the telepathic power of the Panadur. "We know you would have spared us," came the uncanny stream of thought.
Your companion captured me when I, as the chosen leader, went to investigate your arrival. But you deliberately let me go when it meant your own life. But he whose fur was like the angry spot of the greater world would have destroyed us. We read his thoughts. Telepathy! By Mercury's molten heart! Hugh exclaimed in awe, dimly sensing the prodigious mental power of the being. And we were going to eat one of them! He stared around the cave, remembering Jim Brannigan, and it was apparent that Hugh still didn't realize all that had occurred. I suppose that murdering mercenary scum's left long ago with the ship, and here I'm stranded. If I ever get my hands on him, that you will never do. Hugh was aware of the Panadur again, and he saw the shadowy copy of a smile flit over its features. We gave of you our energy, the shimmering silver being transmitted, and we gave of you another life, that you might have yours again. It was but justice. What? What other life? And then Hugh tottered where he stood, swayed sickeningly, as the entire meaning burst upon him. He remembered the scenes in his delirium, when two circles, one of which enclosed him, and another that enclosed a huddled figure, had been formed by Panadurs, while a living chain of the brooding creatures joined the two circles together. He shuddered as he remembered that his own circle seemed to expand, as the other inexorably contracted. There was no choice. The limpid thought message from the Panadur impinged upon Hugh's mind. We know the secret of the release of electronic energy by the disassociation of electronic and neutronic balance in the atomic scale. We reverse the vibration of matter and through magnetic means draw a steady stream of energy, pure energy, from matter in whatever state. In your case, we simply transmitted the energy content of the Redford one to you. Hugh hardly dared to glance in the direction where the huddled figure had been, but with an effort of will he steeled himself against the growing nausea, and resolutely walked over to the thing. He felt his sanity reeling. He was brought back to sanity by the Panadur, who all along had communicated with him. Its fragile six-fingered hand was extended palm upwards, and lying on it was a gleaming jewel. Take it and go. The message came with majestic power, yet there was a world of kindness in it. Go back to your ship. You will find its damage repaired. We have done that for you. With the star of Panadur you will be guided back, as my thoughts center upon it. On the day when you return to our world, gaze upon the star, and you will be helped to find again and gather the crystals you seek. But none from your planet must ever see us again, or even hear of us. I promise, Hugh exclaimed fervently, remembering Jim Brannigan's intent, and that there were many men like Brannigan. Slowly, Hugh left the cave, clutching the dazzling gem through which he could feel a directed flow of thought. He was still a little dazed at this miracle. He wanted to laugh and to cry. But the flooding realization that his ship, repaired and ready, awaited him, that he was free to leave this craggy hell of crimson shadows and arctic nights, left only a vast, singing quiet in his soul, too deep for tears. And that is the end of The Star of Panadur by Albert de Pina and Henry Hassa. Task to Luna by Alfred Koppel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recorded by Atomic Dragons of Mars.
Task to Luna by Alfred Koppel. Published Planet Stories, January 1951. 2 rocket ships bit into lunar dust. 2 men, a Yankee, a Russian, dueled in nightmare shadow and glare, each eager to destroy the enemy. What cosmic joke made them drop their weapons and die laughing? The rockets started almost simultaneously. From 2 widely separated points on the great curving surface of Earth, they reached upward and outward, toward the moon. It wasn't really so strange a coincidence. Space navigation is governed by mathematics and logic, not politics. The fact that man-carrying spaceships happened to be developed concurrently on 2 sides of an iron curtain meant little to the universe. It happened, that's all. And there is a proper time to launch such missiles. When that time came, they were launched. In a manner of speaking, it was a race. A race wherein the prizes were such things as gravity gauge and surveillance point and impregnable launching sites. The contestants were earnest, capable men, each certain that the moon must not fall into the hands of the opponent. It made a stirring and patriotic picture, vivid with nationalistic fervor. It was thrilling with its taste of high adventure and self-sacrifice. For each rocket pilot, it was a personal crusade against the thing he had been raised to regard as the enemy. But somehow, under the steady, cold scrutiny of the eternal stars, they must have looked a little ridiculous. Perhaps just a tiny bit tragic, too. Harsh was the moon. There was black and there was white. Great jagged cliffs and razor-backed mountains slashed the pocked surface of the crater floor, humping themselves at the huge unwinking stars. The sun was a stark disk of fire, incredibly white, hung in the black sky. The shadows were bottomless pools. Within them there was nothing. In the sunlight, the pumice soil glared white. The Russian rocket had crashed on landing. Randick could see the tiny buckled shape of it high on the mountain. No doubt the pilot was dead, but he had to be sure. The risks were too great for any unsupported assumptions. He had to go up there and see for himself. Ponderous in his pressure suit, Randick emerged from the open lock of the Anglo-American rocket. He slogged across the pumice of the crater floor, toward the spot where the mountain's sheer talus erupted skyward. If there were no trouble from the Ruski, he would return to his own ship and begin setting up the first cell of what would soon be the Anglo-American moon base. As soon as he signaled a safe landing, and no opposition from the Russian, other rockets would come to aid their cells, and presently there would be an atomic rocket pointed dead at the heart of every Russian population center. A rocket each, for Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Vladivostok. Randick frowned. It would be a lot simpler if the crash had finished the Russian pilot. He knew the Russians had exactly the same plan for the moon, only the rockets would be aimed at Washington, London, Paris, San Francisco. The slight weight of the one-man bazooka on Randick's back seemed suddenly very comforting. Randick knew himself to be on the very edge of known territory. His map showed him that he was in the highest part of the Dorfell Mountains. Behind him lay the 2 great bowls of Bailey and Shigard, and far to the north he could see, as he climbed higher, the smooth surface of the Mare Humorum. He looked up to the spine-like ridge beyond and slightly above the wreck of the Russian ship. There was a deep pass that slashed like a wound into the backbone of the range. He felt a slight thrill. Beyond that cleft lay mystery, the other side of the moon. The sun's rays beat down brutally. Even through the heavily insulated suit, Randick could feel their searing touch. All around him stretched a jumbled nightmare of black and white. He was suddenly very glad that he could not see the earth in the sky. The homesickness would be unbearable. Randick found himself frowning. He had no time for such thoughts. He was a soldier. He reminded himself that up there in the tangled wreckage of the Russian spaceship, there might be another soldier, ready to kill him. 2 human beings on the moon, each eager to kill. Randick shook his head angrily. He had no right to let his mind dwell on such things. He was within 100 yards of the wreck when a streak of fire and a soundless blast drove him into the shadows. Pumice showered him from the star-shaped depression where the explosive missile had struck. Randick cursed heartily. The Ruski was very much alive, and there wasn't a thing wrong with his eyesight. The shot had been uncomfortably close. Unslinging his bazooka, Randick began to work his way around behind the Russian rocket. A slight movement along the wreckage caught his trained eye, and he launched a projectile at it. It flared wickedly, tearing fragments of metal loose and flinging them fantastic distances down the sheer slope of the ridge. There was no return fire. Randick broke out of the shadow and ran for the cover of a large pumice stone boulder farther up the draw. A sun-bright flash of fire spattered the loose soil 12 feet in front of him. He slid for the darkness on his belly. That one had been a near thing. Behind the boulder lay a trench-like depression that sloped away up the draw toward the pass. Randick dropped into it and began to crawl laboriously upward. If he could flank the Ruski, he could finish this with one good shot. Another explosion rocked the boulder he had just left. Randick didn't even look back. He felt his breath rasping in his throat, and his body felt hot and sticky inside the bulky pressure suit. Glancing down and to his right, he could see the proudly erect shape of his own rocket, far below on the floor of the crater. It took him almost 30 minutes to reach the edge of the shadow that spilled from the side of the mountain pass. To his left, not 10 feet away, was the sudden white glare of the pumice floor. He was well above and almost behind the wreck of the Russian's ship. His flanks were heaving with the exertion of the climb as he searched the buckled mass of the crash for his opponent. There seemed to be a dark shape wedged in between 2 twisted bulkheads. It looked like a man. With pounding heart, Randick murmured a prayer and lifted his bazooka, aimed, and pressed the firing stud. The shadow vanished in silent white fire. The return blast almost knocked him down. For a moment Randick was stunned, wondering foggily where the shot had come from. Then his brain cleared and he realized that the Ruski too had climbed the pass, leaving Randick to fire at shadows. Randick cursed himself for his dangerous stupidity. The other must be among those shadowy rocks, directly across the bright floor of the pass. He raised his bazooka carefully, searching the Stygian blackness for some sign of movement. His finger curled around the firing stud. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the flare. The Russian rocket erupted in a gout of bluish flame, and the whole mountain seemed to rock. Randick stared stupidly at the glowing crater where the ship had been. For just an instant he thought that perhaps a meteorite had struck it, but the explosion had been unquestionably atomic. The Russian must have been stunned too, for he moved out into the light, empty-handed, his helmet turned woodenly toward the rapidly cooling lake of magma where his ship had been. They both saw the bright arc of fire that raced up from beyond the ridge and curved down gracefully toward the floor of the crater far below. Open-mouthed, Randick watched his ship vanish into flame and felt the vague tremor of the ground under him as the shock rumbled across the face of the moon. The Russian rocket was gone. The Anglo-American rocket was gone. Moonbase was gone before it had ever been. The weapon fell from Randick's hand, and he stepped unsteadily into the light toward the Russian. Suddenly, human companionship was very, very important. Panicky terror was plucking at his throat. The two men stumbled toward each other across the pass cut deep into the jagged back of the Dorfell Mountains. As one, they turned and looked out across the vast expanse of the moon's hidden face. They were soldiers. They knew an invasion base when they saw one. As far as the eye could see, lines of sleek mammoth spaceships of unknown design stretched away into the distance. The face of the vast unnamed mare was covered with them. Suddenly, Randick felt himself beginning to giggle. He tried to stop, but the laughter welled up inside of him, echoing wildly within his confining helmet. He could see that the Russian was laughing too, white teeth gleaming behind the plexiglass faceplate. They laughed until they gasped. Their sides hurt with laughter. Tears rolled down their faces. They were arm in arm and still laughing when the third rocket arced down on them from out of the black and star-flecked sky. And that is the end of Task to Luna by Alfred Koppel.
To Pay the Piper by James Blish. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. To Pay the Piper by James Blish. Clearly, re-educating man's brain wouldn't fit him for survival on the plague-ridden surface. Re-educating his body was the answer, but the process was so very long. The man in the white jacket stopped at the door marked Re-Education Project, Colonel H. H. Mudgett, Commanding Officer, and waited while the scanner looked him over. He had been through that door 1,000 times, but the scanner made as elaborate a job of it as if it had never seen him before. It always did, for there was always, in fact, a chance that it had never seen him before, whatever the fallible human beings to whom it reported might think. It went over him from gray, crew-cut pole to reagent-proof shoes, checking his small, wiry body and lean profile against its stored silhouettes, tasting and smelling him as dubiously as if he were an orange held in storage 2 days too long. Name, it said at last. Carson Samuel, 32-454-0698. Business, Medical Director, Re-Ed 1. While Carson waited, a distant, heavy concussion came rolling down upon him through the mile of solid granite above his head. At the same moment, the letters on the door and everything else inside his cone of vision blurred distressingly, and a stab of pure pain went lancing through his head. It was the supersonic component of the explosion, and it was harmless, except that it always both hurt and scared him. The light on the door scanner, which had been glowing yellow up till now, flicked back to red again, and the machine began the whole routine all over. The sound bomb had reset it. Carson patiently endured its inspection, gave his name, serial number, and mission once more, and this time got the green. He went in, unfolding as he walked the flimsy square of cheap paper he had been carrying all along. Mudgett looked up from his desk and said at once, "What now?" The physician tossed the square of paper down under Mudgett's eyes. "Summary of the press reaction to Hamelin's speech last night," he said. "The total effect is going against us, Colonel. Unless we can change Hamelin's mind, this outcry to re-educate civilians ahead of soldiers is going to lose the war for us. The urge to live on the surface again has been mounting for 10 years. Now it's got a target to focus on. Us." Mudgett chewed on a pencil while he read the summary. A blocky, bulky man, as short as Carson and with hair as gray and close-cropped. A year ago, Carson would have told him that nobody in Riyadh could afford to put stray objects in his mouth even once, let alone as a habit. Now Carson just waited. There wasn't a man, or a woman, or a child of America's surviving 35 million sane people who didn't have some such tick. Not now. Not after 25 years of underground life. "He knows it's impossible, doesn't he?" Mudgett demanded abruptly. "Of course he doesn't," Carson said impatiently. "He doesn't know any more about the real nature of the project than the people do. He thinks the educating we do is in some sort of survival technique. That's what the papers think too, as you can plainly see by the way they loaded that editorial." If we had taken direct control of the papers in the first place..." Carson said nothing. Military control of every facet of civilian life was a fact, and Mudgett knew it. He also knew that an appearance of freedom to think is a necessity for the human mind, and that the appearance could not be maintained without a few shreds of the actuality. "Suppose we do this," Mudgett said at last. "Hamelin's position in the State Department makes it impossible for us to muzzle him. But it ought to be possible to explain to him that no unprotected human being can live on the surface, no matter how many merit badges he has for woodcraft and first aid. Maybe we could even take him on a little trip topside. I'll wager he's never seen it." "And what if he dies up there?" Carson said stonily. "We lose 3/5 of every topside party as it is. And Hamelin's an inexperienced might be the best thing, mightn't it?" "No," Carson said. "It would look like we planned it that way. The papers would have the populace boiling by the next morning." Mudgett groaned and nibbled another double row of indentations around the barrel of the pencil. "There must be something," he said. "There is." "Well?" "Bring the man here and show him just what we are doing. Re-educate him if necessary. Once we told the newspapers that he's taken the course, well, who knows? They might just resent it, abusing his clearance privileges and so on." "We'd be violating our basic policy," Mudgett said slowly. "Give the earth back to the men who fight for it. Still, the idea has some merits." "Hamelin is out in the antechamber right now," Carson said. "Shall I bring him in?" The radioactivity never did rise much beyond a mildly hazardous level, and that was only transient during the second week of the war, the week called the death of cities. The small shards of sanity retained by the high commands on both sides dictated avoiding weapons with a built-in backfire. No cobalt bombs were dropped, no territories permanently poisoned. Generals still remembered that unoccupied territory, no matter how devastated, is still unconquered territory. But no such consideration stood in the way of biological warfare. It was controllable. You never released against the enemy any disease you didn't yourself know how to control. There would be some slips, of course, but the margin for error... There were some slips, but for the most part, biological warfare worked fine. The great fevers washed like tides around and around the globe, one after another. In such cities as had escaped the bombings, the rumble of truck convoys carrying the puffed, heaped corpses to the mass graves became the only sound except for sporadic small arms fire. And then that too ceased, and the trucks stood rusting in rows. Nor were human beings the sole victims. Cattle fevers were sent out. Wheat rusts, rice molds, corn blights, hog choleras, poultry enteritises fountained into the indifferent air from the hidden laboratories, or were loosed far aloft in the jet stream by rocketing fleets. Gelatin capsules, pullulating with gill rots, fell like hail into the great fishing grounds of Newfoundland, Oregon, Japan, Sweden, Portugal. Hundreds of species of animals were drafted as secondary hosts for human diseases, were injected and released to carry the blessings of the laboratories to their mates and litters. It was discovered that minute amounts of the tetracycline series of antibiotics, which had long been used as feed supplements to bring farm animals to full market weight early, could also be used to raise the most whopping Anopheles and Aedes mosquitoes anybody ever saw, capable of flying long distances against the wind and of carrying a peculiarly interesting new strain of the malarial parasite and the yellow fever virus. By the time it had ended, everyone who remained alive was a mile underground. For good. I still fail to understand why, Hamlin said. If, as you claim, you have methods of re-educating soldiers for surface life, you can't do so for civilians as well, or instead. The undersecretary, a tall, spare man, bald on top, and with a heavily creased forehead, spoke with the odd neutral accent, untinged by regionalism, of the trained diplomat, despite the fact that there had been no such thing as a foreign service for nearly half a century. We're going to try to explain that to you, Carson said. But we thought that, first of all, we'd try to explain once more why we think it would be bad policy, as well as physically out of the question. Sure, everyone wants to go topside as soon as it's possible. Even people who are reconciled to these endless caverns and corridors hope for something better for their children, a glimpse of sunlight, a little rain, the fall of a leaf. That's more important now to all of us than the war, which we don't believe in any longer. That doesn't even make any military sense, since we haven't the numerical strength to occupy the enemy's territory anymore, and they haven't the strength to occupy ours. We understand all that, but we also know that the enemy is intent on prosecuting the war to the end. Extermination is what they say they want on their propaganda broadcasts, and your own department reports that they seem to mean what they say. So we can't give up fighting them. That would be simple suicide. Are you still with me? Yes, but I don't see. Give me a moment more. If we have to continue to fight, we know this much, that the first of the two sides to get men on the surface again, so as to be able to attack important targets, not just keep them isolated in seas of plagues, will be the side that will bring this war to an end. They know that too. We have good reason to believe that they have a re-education project, and that it's about as far advanced as ours is. Look at it this way. Colonel Mudgett burst in unexpectedly. What we have now is a stalemate. A saboteur occasionally locates one of the underground cities and lets the pestilences into it, sometimes on our side, sometimes on theirs. But that only happens sporadically, and it's just more of this mutual extermination business, to which we're committed willy-nilly for as long as they are. If we can get troops onto the surface first, we'll be able to scout out their important installations in short order and issue them a surrender ultimatum with teeth in it. They'll take it. The only other course is the sort of slow mutual suicide we've got now. Hamlin put the tips of his fingers together. You gentlemen lecture me about policy as if I'd never heard the word before. I'm familiar with your arguments for sending soldiers first. You assume that you're familiar with all of mine for starting with civilians, but you're wrong, because some of them haven't been brought up at all outside the department. I'm going to tell you some of them, and I think they'll merit your close attention. Carson shrugged. I'd like nothing more to be convinced, Mr. Secretary. Go ahead. You, of all people, should know, Dr. Carson, how close our underground society is to a psychotic break. To take a single instance, the number of juvenile gangs roaming these corridors of ours has increased 400% since the rumors about the re-education project began to spread. Or another, the number of individual crimes without motive, crimes committed just to distract the committer from the grinding monotony of the life we all lead, has now passed the total of all other crimes put together. And as for actual insanity, of our 35 million people still unhospitalized, there are 4 million cases of which we know, each one of which should be committed right now for early paranoid schizophrenia, except that were we to commit them, our essential industries would suffer a manpower loss more devastating than any the enemy has inflicted upon us. Every one of those 4 million persons is a major hazard to his neighbors and to his job. But how can we do without them? And what can we do about the unrecognized, subclinical cases, which probably total twice as many? How long can we continue operating without a collapse under such conditions? Carson mopped his brow. I didn't suspect that it had gone on that far. It has gone on that far, Hamlin said icily, and it is accelerating. Your own project has helped to accelerate it. Colonel Mudgett here mentioned the opening of isolated cities to the pestilences. Shall I tell you how Louisville fell? A spy again, I suppose, Mudgett said. No, Colonel, not a spy. A band of vigilantes, of mutineers. I'm familiar with your slogan, the earth to those who fight for it. Do you know the counter slogan that's circulating among the people? They waited. Hamlin smiled and said, Let's die on the surface. They overwhelmed the military detachment there, put the city administration to death, and blew open the shaft of the surface. About 1,000 people actually made it to the top. Within 24 hours, the city was dead, as the ringleaders had been warned would be the outcome. The warning didn't deter them, nor did it protect the prudent citizens who had no part in the affair. Hamlin leaned forward suddenly. People won't wait to be told when it's their turn to be re-educated. They'll be tired of waiting, tired to the point of insanity of living at the bottom of a hole. They'll just go. And that, gentlemen, will leave the world to the enemy, or more likely, the rats. They alone are immune to everything by now. There was a long silence. At last, Carson said mildly, Why aren't we immune to everything by now? Eh? Why, the new generations. They've never been exposed. We still have a reservoir of older people who lived through the war, people who had one or several of the new diseases that swept the world, some as many as 5, and yet recovered. They still have their immunities, we know. We've tested them. We know from sampling that no new disease has been introduced by either side in over 10 years now. Against all the known ones, we have immunization techniques, anti-sera, antibiotics, and so on. I suppose you get your shots every 6 months like all the rest of us. We should all be very hard to infect now, and such infections as do take should run mild courses. Carson held the Undersecretary's eyes grimly. Now answer me this question. Why is it that, despite all these protections, every single person in an open city dies? I don't know, Hamlin said, staring at each of them in turn. By your showing, some of them should recover. They should, Carson said, but nobody does. Why? Because the very nature of disease has changed since we all went underground. There are now abroad in the world a number of mutated bacterial strains which can bypass the immunity mechanisms of the human body altogether. What this means in simple terms is that, should such a germ get into your body, your body wouldn't recognize it as an invader. You would manufacture no antibodies against the germ. Consequently, the germ could multiply without any check, and you would die. So would we all. I see, Hamelin said. He seemed to have recovered his composure extraordinarily rapidly. I'm no scientist, gentlemen, but what you tell me makes our position sound perfectly hopeless. Yet obviously you have some answer. Harson nodded. We do. But it's important for you to understand the situation, otherwise the answer will mean nothing to you. So, is it perfectly clear to you now, from what we've said so far, that no amount of re-educating a man's brain, be he soldier or civilian, will allow him to survive on the surface? Quite clear, Hamelin said, apparently ungrudgingly. Harson's hope rose by a fraction of a millimeter. But if you don't re-educate his brain, what can you re-educate? His reflexes, perhaps? No, Carson said. His lymph nodes and his spleen. A scornful grin began to appear on Hamelin's thin lips. You need better public relations counsel than you've been getting, he said. If what you say is true, as of course I assume it is, then the term re-educate is not only inappropriate, it's downright misleading. If you had chosen a less suggestive and more accurate label in the beginning, I wouldn't have been able to cause you half the trouble I have. I agree we were badly advised there, Carson said, but not entirely for those reasons. Of course the name is misleading. That's both a characteristic and a function of the names of top-secret projects. But in this instance, the name re-education, bad as it now appears, subjected the men who chose it to a fatal temptation. You see, though it is misleading, it is also entirely accurate. Word games, Hamelin said. Not at all, Mudgett interposed. We were going to spare you the theoretical reasoning behind our project, Mr. Secretary, but now you'll just have to sit still for it. The fact is that the body's ability to distinguish between its own cells and those of some foreign tissue, a skin graft, say, or a bacterial invasion of the blood, isn't an inherited ability. It's a learned reaction. Furthermore, if you'll think about it a moment, you'll see that it has to be. Body cells die, too, and have to be disposed of. What would happen if removing those dead cells provoked an antibody reaction, as the destruction of foreign cells does? We'd die of anaphylactic shock while we were still infants. For that reason, the body has to learn how to scavenge selectively. In human beings, that lesson isn't learned completely until about a month after birth. During the intervening time, the newborn infant is protected by antibodies that it gets from the colostrum, the first milk it gets from the breast during the 3 or 4 days immediately after birth. It can't generate its own. It isn't allowed to, so to speak, until it's learned the trick of cleaning up body residues without triggering the antibody mechanisms. Any dead cells marked personal have to be dealt with some other way. That seems clear enough, Hamelin said, but I don't see its relevance. Well, we're in a position now where that differentiation between the self and everything outside the body doesn't do us any good anymore. These mutated bacteria have been selfed by the mutation. In other words, some of their protein molecules, probably deoxyribonucleic acid molecules, carry configurations or recognition units identical with those of our body cells, so that the body can't tell one from another. But what does all this have to do with re-education? Just this, Carson said. What we do here is to impose upon the cells of the body, all of them, a new set of recognition units for the guidance of the lymph nodes and the spleen, which are the organs that produce antibodies. The new units are highly complex, and the chances of their being duplicated by bacterial evolution, even under forced draft, are too small to worry about. That's what re-education is. In a few moments, if you like, we'll show you just how it's done. Hamelin ground out his 5th cigarette in Mudgett's ashtray and placed the tips of his fingers together thoughtfully. Carson wondered just how much of the concept of recognition marking the undersecretary had absorbed. It had to be admitted that he was astonishingly quick to take hold of abstract ideas, but the self-marker theory of immunity was, like everything else in immunology, almost impossible to explain to laymen, no matter how intelligent. This process, Hamelin said hesitantly, it takes a long time? About 6 hours per subject, and we can only handle one man at a time. That means we can count on putting no more than 7,000 troops into the field by the turn of the century. Every one will have to be a highly trained specialist if we're to bring the war to a quick conclusion. Which means no civilians, Hamelin said. I see. I'm not entirely convinced, but by all means, let's see how it's done. Once inside, the undersecretary tried his best to look everywhere at once. The room cut into the rock was roughly 200 feet high. Most of it was occupied by the bulk of the re-education monitor, a mechanism as tall as a 15-story building and about a city block square. Guards watched it on all sides, and the face of the machine swarmed with technicians. Incredible, Hamelin murmured. That enormous object can process only one man at a time? That's right, Mudgett said. Luckily, it doesn't have to treat all the body cells directly. It works through the blood, reselfing the cells by means of small changes in the serum chemistry. What kind of changes? Well, Carson said, choosing each word carefully. That's more or less a graveyard secret, Mr. Secretary. We can tell you this much. The machine uses a vast array of crystalline, complex sugars which behave rather like the blood group and type proteins. They're fed into the serum in minute amounts under feedback control of second-by-second analysis of the blood. The computations involved in deciding upon the amount and the precise nature of each introduced chemical are highly complex, hence the size of the machine. It is, in its major effect, an artificial kidney. I've seen artificial kidneys in the hospitals, Hamelin said, frowning. They're rather compact affairs, because all they do is remove waste products from the patient's blood and restore the fluid and electrolyte balance. Those are very minor renal functions in the higher animals. The organ's main duty is chemical control of immunity. If Burnett and Fenner had known that back in 1949, when the selfing theory was being formulated, we'd have had re-education long before now. Most of the machine's size is due to the computation section, Mudgett emphasized. In the body, the brainstem does those computations as part of maintaining homeostasis. But we can't reach the brainstem from outside. It's not under conscious control. Once the body is reselfed, it'll retrain the thalamus where we can't. Suddenly, 2 swinging doors at the base of the machine were pushed apart, and a mobile operating table came through, guided by 2 attendants. There was a form on it, covered to the chin with a sheet. The face above the sheet was immobile and almost as white. Hamelin watched the table go out of the huge cavern with visibly mixed emotions. He said, "This process? It's painful?" "No, not exactly," Carson said. The motive behind the question interested him hugely, but he didn't dare show it. But any fooling around with the immunity mechanisms can give rise to symptoms. Fever, general malaise, and so on. We try to protect our subjects by giving them a light shock anesthesia first. Shock, Hamelin repeated. You mean electroshock? I don't see how. Call it stress anesthesia instead. We give the man a steroid drug that counterfeits the anesthesia the body itself produces in moments of great stress, on the battlefield, say, or just after a serious injury. It's fast and free of after effects. There's no secret about that, by the way. The drug involved is 21-hydroxypregnane, 20-dione sodium succinate, and it dates all the way back to 1955. Oh, the Undersecretary said. The ringing sound of the chemical name had, as Carson had hoped, a ritually soothing effect. Gentlemen, Hamlin said hesitantly. Gentlemen, I have a rather unusual request, and I'm afraid a rather selfish one. A brief, nervous laugh. Selfish in both senses, if you will pardon me the pun. You need feel no hesitation in refusing me, but... Abruptly, he appeared to find it impossible to go on. Carson mentally crossed his fingers and plunged in. You would like to undergo the process yourself, he said. Well, yes. Yes, that's exactly it. Does that seem inconsistent? I should know, should I not, what it is that I'm advocating for my following? Know it intimately from personal experience, not just theory? Of course, I realize that it would conflict with your policy, but I assure you I wouldn't turn it to any political advantage. None whatsoever. And perhaps it wouldn't be too great a lapse of policy to process just one civilian among your 7,000 soldiers. Subverted, by God! Carson looked at Mudgett with a firmly straight face. It wouldn't do to accept too quickly. But Hamlin was rushing on, almost chattering now. I can understand your hesitation. You must feel that I'm trying to gain some advantage, or even to get to the surface ahead of my fellow men. If it will set your minds at rest, I would be glad to enlist in your advance army. Before 5 years are up, I could surely learn some technical skill which would make me useful to the expedition. If you would prepare papers to that effect, I'd be happy to sign them. That's hardly necessary, Mudgett said. After you're re-educated, we can simply announce the fact and say that you've agreed to join the advance party when the time comes. Ah, Hamlin said. I see the difficulty. No, that would make my position quite impossible. If there's no other way... Excuse us a moment, Carson said. Hamlin bowed, and the doctor pulled Mudgett off out of earshot. Don't overplay it, he murmured. You're tipping our hand with that talk about a press release, Colonel. He's offering us a bribe, but he's plenty smart enough to see that the price you're suggesting is that of his whole political career. He won't pay that much. What then? Mudgett whispered hoarsely. Get somebody to prepare the kind of informal contract he suggested. Offer to put it under security seal so we won't be able to show it to the press at all. He'll know well enough that such a seal can be broken if our policy ever comes before a presidential review, and that will restrain him from forcing such a review. Let's not demand too much. Once he's been re-educated, he'll have to live the rest of the 5 years with the knowledge that he can live topside at any time he wants to try it. And he hasn't had the discipline our men have had. It's my bet that he'll goof off before the 5 years are up. And good riddance. They went back to Hamlin, who was watching the machine and humming in a painfully abstracted manner. I've convinced the colonel, Carson said, that your services in the Army might well be very valuable when the time comes, Mr. Secretary. If you'll sign up, we'll put the papers under security seal for your own protection, and then I think we can fit you into our treatment program today. I'm grateful to you, Dr. Carson, Hamlin said. Very grateful indeed. 5 minutes after his injection, Hamlin was as peaceful as a flounder and was rolled through the swinging doors. An hour's discussion of the probable outcome, carried on in the privacy of Mudgett's office, bore very little additional fruit, however. It's our only course, Carson said. It's what we hope to gain from his visit, duly modified by circumstances. It all comes down to this. Hamlin's compromised himself, and he knows it. But, Mudgett said, suppose he was right. What about all that talk of his about mass insanity? I'm sure it's true, Carson said, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts at control. It's going to be rougher than ever down here for the next 5 years, Colonel. Our only consolation is that the enemy must have exactly the same problem, and if we can beat them to the surface." Mudgett said. Carson had already broken off his sentence. He wondered why the scanner gave a man such a hard time outside that door, and then admitted him without any warning to the people on the other side. Couldn't the damn thing be trained to knock? The newcomer was a page from the hematology section. "Here's the preliminary rundown on your student X, Dr. Carson," he said. The page saluted Mudgett and went out. Carson began to read. After a moment, he also began to sweat. "Colonel, look at this. I was wrong after all. Disastrously wrong. I haven't seen a blood type distribution pattern like Hamelin since I was a medical student, and even then it was only a demonstration, not a real-life patient. Look at it from the genetic point of view, the migration factors." He passed the protocol across the desk. Mudgett was not by background a scientist, but he was an enormously able administrator, of the breed that makes it its business to know the technicalities on which any project ultimately rests. He was not more than halfway through the tally before his eyebrows were gaining altitude like shock waves. "Carson, we can't let that man into the machine. He's already in it, Colonel. You know that. And if we interrupt the process before it runs to term, we'll kill him." "Let's kill him then," Mudgett said harshly. "Say he died while being processed. Do the country a favor. That would produce a hell of a stink. Besides, we have no proof." Mudgett flourished the protocol excitedly. "That's not proof to anyone but a hematologist." "But Carson, the man's a saboteur," Mudgett shouted. "Nobody but an Asiatic could have a typing pattern like this. And he's no melting pot product either. He's a classical mixture, very probably a Georgian. And every move he's made since we first heard of him has been aimed directly at us. Aimed directly at tricking us into getting him into the machine." "I think so too," Carson said grimly. "I just hope the enemy hasn't many more agents as brilliant." "One's enough," Mudgett said. "He's sure to be loaded to the last cc of his blood with catalyst poisons. Once the machine starts processing his serum, we're done for. It'll take us years to reprogram the computer if it can be done at all. It's got to be stopped." "Stopped?" Carson said, astonished. "But it's already stopped. That's not what worries me. The machine stopped it 50 minutes ago." "It can't have. How could it? It has no relevant data." "Sure it has." Carson leaned forward, took the cruelly chewed pencil away from Mudgett, and made a neat check beside one of the entries on the protocol. Mudgett stared at the checked item. "Platelets, RH6, he mumbled. "But what's that got to do with—" Oh, I see. That platelet type doesn't exist at all in our population now, does it? Never seen it before myself, at least." "No," Carson said, grinning wolfishly. "It never was common in the West, and the pogrom of 1981 wiped it out. That's something the enemy couldn't know. But the machine knows it. As soon as it gives him the standard anti-IV desensitization shot, his platelets will begin to dissolve, and he'll be rejected for incipient thrombocytopenia." He laughed. "For his own protection, but he's getting nitrous oxide in the machine, and he'll be held 6 hours under anesthesia anyway, also for his own protection." Mudgett broke in. He was grinning back at Carson like an idiot. "When he comes out from under, he'll assume that he's been re-educated, and he'll beat it back to the enemy to report that he's poisoned our machine, so that they can be sure they'll beat us to the surface. And he'll go the fastest way. Overland." "He will," Carson agreed. "Of course he'll go overland, and of course he'll die. But where does that leave us? We won't be able to conceal that he was treated here if there's any sort of inquiry at all, and his death will make everything we do here look like a fraud. Instead of paying our Pied Piper And great jumping Jehoshaphat, look at his name. They were rubbing our noses in it all the time. Nevertheless, we didn't pay the piper. We killed him. And platelets RH6 won't be an adequate excuse for the press or for Hamlin's following. Doesn't worry me, Mudgett rumbled. Who'll know? He won't die in our labs. He'll leave here, hale and hearty. He won't die until he makes a break for the surface. After that, we can compose a fine obituary for the press. Heroic government official on the highest policy level, couldn't wait to lead his followers to the surface. Died of being too much in a hurry. Re-Ed Project sorrowfully reminds everyone that no technique is foolproof. Mudgett paused long enough to light a cigarette, which was a most singular action for a man who never smoked. As a matter of fact, Carson, he said, it's a natural. Carson considered it. It seemed to hold up. And Hamlin would have a death certificate as complex as he deserved. Not officially, of course, but in the minds of everyone who knew the facts. His death, when it came, would be due directly to the thrombocytopenia which had caused the Re-Ed machine to reject him. And thrombocytopenia is a disease of infants, unless ye become as little children. That was a fitting reason for rejection from the new kingdom of earth, anemia of the newborn. His pent-out breath went out of him in a long sigh. He hadn't been aware that he had been holding it. It's true, he said softly. That's the time to pay the piper. When? Mudgett said. When? Carson said, surprised. Why, before he takes the children away. End of To Pay the Piper by James Blish. Read by Paul Hampton.
Tydore's Gift by Alfred Koppel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Atomic Dragons of Mars. Tydore's Gift by Alfred Koppel. First published in Planet Stories, September 1951. So unpredictable, these dead world tower dwellers. Take old Tydore, who placed such an inestimably valuable gift in the greed hands of one he hated. The sun was a shrunken red disk against the star fields, a distant pale luminosity surrendering to the encroachment of the falling night. Hoar-frost crunched under Marley's feet as he walked by the still black waters of the canal, and then thin wind whispered over the sand and across the breasts of the ancient hills. Starlight gleamed in the dark water as the day faded. Earth hung low in the sky, like an emerald pendant over the bosom of a sleeping woman. Marley pulled his silks and furs closer about his shoulders. The air was sharp and cold. His breath froze, wraith-like, in the icy evening as he hurried down the path towards Tydore's tower. The green planet shone like a beacon in his eyes. Home. The thought brought impatience and a longing to walk under a pale sky and a warm sun. He looked about him with faint distaste. This peace, this solitude of low red hills and blue-black nights was alien to Marley. It was unreal. Mars was a dream, an ancient, wasted, slumbering dream. Marley's lips compressed as he thought of Tydore and their last meeting. It seemed that Tydore laughed at him. Tydore withheld too much, and there was so little time left. There was an acrid core of decadence in the old Martian, Marley thought,
a consciousness of too many millennia of civilization and decay. Devious was the word, perhaps, though it seemed a pallid one for the reality of the Martian's intricate mind. It was always impossible to know what he was thinking, how much he knew about Marley being a spy, about the war on Earth. In spite of himself, Marley smiled. It sounded so melodramatic that way, but it was the way it really was. The Martians held the perfect weapon. Marley needed that weapon, and his nation had put forth a gigantic effort to get him to Mars so that he might steal it. Tydore's tower loomed up before him in the fading light, a fey filigree of minarets and graceful flying buttresses, too delicate for a grosser world than Mars. The tower's reflection shimmered in the still dark waters of the canal, like an alter ego extending deep into the liquid depths. Marley descended the steps of delicately wrought stone that led to the tower's underground entrance with care, for the drifted ferric sand made them treacherous. How like the Martians, he thought with some irritation, to make it necessary to travel down in order to enter a tower. Everything the long way, the hard and devious way. The outer doorway was shaped like a fleur-de-lis, and it opened from the top down, sliding into a recess of ancient, oily machinery. It would be far too simple to make a door that looked and worked like a door. Everything Marley had seen during his months on Mars served only to increase his sense of alienage. He had seen only Tydore, of course, of the living Martians. There were only a handful left, and they lived in their isolated towers along the still canals, surrounded by their tissue-thin manuscripts and ancient reed-like music spools that filled the air of their retreats with skeins of weird and enharmonic melody. The weapon was Tydore's. He had rebuilt it from plans drawn by some ensorcelled armorer dead over 5,000 years. Rebuilt it in the paradoxical way that Martians seem to do everything, for if there was one thing that no Martian needed, it was a weapon. No strife had marred the planet's peace for millennia. But built it he had, and Marley's hands itched for the sleek deadliness of it, the smooth-grained stock, the oddly wrought, ornate muzzle. There was a vicious, tangy violence frozen into every line of the weapon. And it was the only handgun Marley had ever seen that chained the forces of the atom. With such weapons, an army could be invincible. Tydore stood to greet him. With the elaborate courtesy of his kind, he performed the ritual gestures of welcome, his slender, finely veined hands tracing the ancient symbols in the air. "The gods of sand and wind have brought you safely to my house, man of earth. I give thanks and pray you find peace and wisdom within my walls." The old Martian's chanting voice was like the fluting grace of a scarlatti choral. It was one with the minuscule paintings that covered the walls, the finely wrought carvings on the antique flagstones under his feet. Marley was not at home in the fluid Martian tongue, but the very sound of the words conjured for him the serried ranks of spectral generations that had reached their culmination in this one robed ancient. And yet, he thought with irritation, Tydore's words mean not at all what they said. Through the finely polished phrases of welcome ran a thread of hidden mockery, even hate, for Marley and everything he represented. Never once had Tydore, by word or deed, indicated that he felt anything but friendship for his visitor from the silvery ship out on the desert, and yet there was no mistaking the nuance of contempt. Tydore despised Marley as an outworld savage, one with the despoilers of the holy places of Mars. Not that the Martians had gods. They had lived too long for that, and their deities existed only in their beautifully turned phrases and their hyper-cultured ritual. But the first men from Earth had looted the libraries and shattered the soaring towers. It was a thing no Martian would ever forget or forgive. It marked Earthmen for what they were. In Martian eyes, precocious barbarians, targets for Martian subtlety. "I give thanks for your welcome," Marley said slowly, his tongue clumsy on the singing syllables. Tydore inclined his head slightly and indicated that Marley should follow him up the winding ramp that pierced the core of the tower. Each time Marley came, the ritual was the same, as unchanging as the still waters of the dark canals or the frozen loneliness of the red hills beyond. They would pass the first level, where the old engines supplied Tydore with what little heat and sustenance he needed. They would go on to the second level, where the music spools lay in ordered confusion amid the sonic transcribers that Tydore used to weave the sounds of the Martian night into atonal poems of melody. And then they would reach the level of the weapon. It would still be in its crystal case, guarded by a lock of bronze. A lock to which there was one key, and that one key on a silver chain around Tydore's neck. They would pass the weapon by and seek the top level, a platform shielded against the frigid night by a crystal canopy. And there they would begin their nightly fencing with words and ideas under the guise of friendship. Marley's heart was pounding suddenly as he drew near to the weapon. His patience was failing him at long last, he knew. He was sick of Mars, sick of Tydore, sick of posing as a humble seeker after knowledge. If he could not trick the Martian into parting with the weapon soon, he knew that he must chance violence. He had not dared it before, because he could never be sure that Tydore and his kind were as defenseless as they seemed. It was paradoxical that they should possess a weapon such as the weapon, and yet be unwilling or unable to use it. Still, it seemed to Marley that such must be the case. He could only explain it to himself by saying that they had lived too long, amid too much deviousness and inverted purpose to be quite virile. They were, the word came readily to mind from his day's training on Earth, decadent. And the meek did not inherit the earth or anything else, he told himself with satisfaction, only the militant, the ruthless. The time had come, Marley thought, for the calculated risk. Direct action. He could scarcely contain himself as they passed the weapon and climbed to the top level. "You seem preoccupied tonight, Marley," Tydore said, pouring 2 tiny goblets of wine. "Can it be you grow tired of Mars?" Marley sipped the wine thoughtfully. To him it seemed completely insipid and without flavor. Subtlety again? He doubted it. "I mean to ask a favor of you, Tydore," he said, "and I but ponder how I should begin." "My house is yours," the Martian replied softly, "and all that it contains." Marley's eyes narrowed. Did he imagine the accent on the last phrase, or was it actually there? He decided to be very cautious. I came here, as you know, he said, to learn everything I might about your kind. As you know, we of Earth are a young race, still much in need of guidance and knowledge. You have learned much, Tydore said. Marley's tone grew harder. But not enough. Tydore's eyebrows arched delicately. So, you have read my books, listened to my music. You have tasted the wines and eaten the fruits of Mars. You have seen the stars and the sand, the waters and the lichens. Have you not known my world? I want more, Marley said flatly. Tydore smiled. In that smile, Marley saw a flash of more distilled venom and ancient hatred than he could have imagined existed. The utter virulence of it left him shaken, and his illogical fear brought anger. He got to his feet, the tiny goblet in hand. It was old and delicate, a tiny gem of carved jade and ivory. To one such as Tydore, priceless. Brutally, Marley crushed it to shards in his hands and dropped it to the flagstones. The fragments tinkled as they fell. So it must always be, said Tydore in a soft voice. I have not come here to listen to music, Tydore, Marley said, nor to read your books or to know your world. You have one thing that I want. You will give it to me, or I will take it from you. He ground his heel onto the remains of the goblet with a grating sound. The weapon, the Martian said. You want the weapon. You may have it. You need not have broken my goblet. Marley was almost sorry that he had won so easily. He suddenly wanted to crush the old Martian as he had crushed the goblet. In both, there was a quality that eluded him, and it was maddening. Tydore handed him the key. Come, we will get it together. Marley followed him cautiously, alert for any trickery. Presently they stood before the case, and Marley unlocked it, reaching greedily for the polished stock. He cradled the gun in his arms lovingly, savoring the triumph. With this in his hands, he could defy a world. There is no other like it, nor any but I to make one, Tydore said with a strange smile. Why did you make it? Asked Marley. I made it for you. Marley laughed aloud. It was an alien sound in the thin, cold air of the tower. You're a liar, Tydore. You built this weapon long before I ever left Earth, and you know it. By you, I meant simply men like you, Tydore said. When the first Earthmen came and befouled Mars with their presence, I knew that I must make the weapon. He smiled, showing even white teeth. A small triumph, but things are not to be measured whether they are great or small, rather by their flavor, their grace, and their neatness. Marley? You speak of triumph, old man, snorted Marley derisively, while your precious weapon is in my hands. Tydore shrugged. As I knew it would be one day when I spread the tales of what the weapon would do. It drew you as a lodestone draws a sliver of iron. Marley felt a pang of panic. You mean this thing is a fake? Tydore shook his head. No counterfeit. It will do what I said it would do. Kill. What more can one ask of a weapon? It was Marley's turn to smile. Nothing. There's only this one. And if you were to die... Tydore smiled a veiled smile. It is as the gods of sand and wind decree. Marley pointed the weapon at Tydore. He had only to kill the old Martian and return to his ship. The mission was over. Completed. He was done with Mars and with Tydore and his subtle scorn. He cradled the weapon lovingly, laying his cheek to the carven stock. Old Tydore had built well. There was a perfect balance in the feel of it. His finger curled around the trigger, and he sighted carefully down the long barrel at the robed figure of the Martian. Tydore was smiling in the face of death, and Marley wanted to laugh out loud. This is the way the world ends, he was thinking. Not with a bang, but a whimper. He squeezed the trigger. The universe exploded in Marley's face. There was a streak of searing pain that carried away half his face, and as he fell, he could hear a strange sound. For the first time, Tydore was laughing aloud. It was a hideous sound. A voice for the torment and hatred of a race that had lived too long, planned too much. Marley felt the tower pinwheel around him. The flagstones leapt up to meet him, greeting the searing agony of his face with the soundless laughter of a million intricate patterns of lonely death. And blackness welled up out of the stones to engulf him. But not before he knew. Tydore had made the weapon with the muzzle resembling the stock. It was as simple as that. And that is the end of Tydore's Gift by Alfred Koppel.
Wanderlust by Alan E. Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Justin S. Barrett. Wanderlust by Alan E. Norse. Somehow George Barlow had sensed that something was wrong the moment his son drove into the barnyard that evening. He had been waiting impatiently for Tad's return all afternoon. The men needed those tractor bolts before they could do the mowing. But George had felt the uneasiness quite suddenly, deep in his chest, when he heard the boy's three-wheeler chugging up the rutted country road from town. He sat quietly, waiting, stroking old Snuffy behind the ears. He heard the little motor car pop into silence as Tad drove it into the garage. Then there was a long silence. George waited several minutes before running his hand through his tawny hair. "What's that boy doing out there anyway?" he growled. Florence Barlow glanced up through the kitchen window. "He's gone up on the ridge," she said. "He's just standing up there, looking down the valley." She turned back to the stove, pushing back an unruly wisp of graying hair. George sat back in his chair, puffing his pipe, the uneasiness growing. Tad was usually back from town hours earlier. The oats had to be cut this week. The shipment of Venusian taro was due from the next rocket, and they had to have a field free for it. But still, he knew it was more than the tractor bolts that bothered him. Then suddenly the door burst open, and Tad was there, filling the room with his broad shoulders, whistling tunelessly to himself. A cool east breeze followed him in the door, and with it an aura of excitement. Tad's sun-baked hair was wild from the ride through the wind, his sharp eyes sparkling. "Dad, the rocket landed this afternoon! Out at Dillon's Landing! It's 3 weeks early this time!" A chill swept up George's spine, tingling his scalp. "Then we should get the taro in a couple of days," he said smoothly. "We should." Tad's eyes were bright as he patted the dog's head. His whole body seemed alive with excitement. "I walked up on the ridge to get a look at it, Dad. It's a beauty. Tall and slim. Oh, you should see it down there. It catches the sunset like you never saw before." He was still talking as he walked out to the kitchen, stooping to kiss his mother on the forehead. "You ought to go up and take a look at it, Mom, before the sun's gone." "I've got plenty to do without going to gawk at a rocket ship." His mother's voice was sharp. "You have too, for that matter. Did you get the tractor bolts for your father?" The boy frowned suddenly and snapped his fingers. "Plumb forgot them. The ship was landing just as I got into town, so I went over to watch it." He took his place opposite his father at the table, his face brightening again. He didn't see the cloud on his father's face. "And they let us go inside it to look around, Dad. Oh, I never saw anything like it. You wouldn't believe that they could get such a ship off the ground. Why, even I can remember when it was all they could do to blast off with a little 10-man ship, and now, why, this one is like a yacht. It's the Star King, the newest one in Dillon's fleet." George Barlow scowled, the tightness in the pit of his stomach suddenly making his food tasteless. "That's lovely," he said sourly. "They can build them a mile long for all I care. They still aren't fit for rats. At least here you can wash your face if you want to." He turned back to his plate, hoping the discussion was over. Hoping. "But this one had complete showers, soft bunks, everything. Hydroponic tanks that make the experimental station look like pikers." "Eat," said George. Tad lapsed into silence, the hearty silence of a hungry 19-year-old before a full dinner plate. His father took another mouthful and put down his fork, his appetite gone. He could feel the tension growing, the tightness of his breathing. He sensed his wife's apprehension as she too slowed and stopped eating, as if she too were waiting. "Saw Len Cooper when he came off the ship too, Dad. Do you remember Len? This was his first cruise." Tad's eyes sparkled. "He says there's nothing like it, that rocket life. They stopped on Venus, you know, and then did a reconnaissance in toward the Mercury orbit before they came back. Almost 5 years away from Earth. They've got a stack of reports as big as an almanac for printing. And Len, you know how scrawny he was. He's put on muscle now. Looks great." Tad put down his fork, a subtle change in his voice, his hands trembling. "We had a long talk, Dad. Len says—" "Len Cooper's a fool," George Barlow's voice snapped irritably. "He hasn't got all his marbles. A kid like that, all the potential in the world, brains, opportunity, and what does he do with it? Shoots it into rockets. First cruise, huh? It isn't his last by a long shot. Those rocket boys aren't stupid. They know it takes a good cruise to teach a youngster his way around out there. He can't begin to work for his wages until the second cruise or the third, and then it's too late to come back." Tad fiddled with his fork, his eyes down. The room was silent. Even Florence sat tense, startled by the outburst. George sat glumly. That was stupid, he thought. Inexcusably stupid. You'll have to face it someday, you know that. Now? Maybe. Oh, Lord, not now. Maybe tomorrow. But what could you say? What if it is now? His hand trembled as he fumbled awkwardly for his pipe. Where were the words, the phrases, the arguments, so long rehearsed, so sensible, so fatherly? Dad? His fingers were like ice on the pipe bowl. Not tomorrow, then. Now. Dad? Yes, Tad. The boy looked straight at his father, his voice very low. I'm going, Dad, he said. I'm going with it. The chill widened in George Barlow's stomach, spreading into his legs and chest. He heard his wife's startled gasp, and the chill deepened. He searched for words, and no words came. How long now had he prepared, rehearsed, and now? Nothing. He just sat there in the dead still room. Well, I never heard anything more ridiculous in all my life, Florence burst out finally. You're crazy, Tad, plumb crazy. Do you mean to sit there and say that you're going to give up college? Throw away this farm? She set the cream pitcher down with a thump. It's out of the question. You just can't mean it. Tad wriggled uneasily. I do mean it, Mom. The Star King is sending up crew tomorrow. They have places for 4 novices this time. They'll take me. I know they will. I asked this afternoon. I want to go. George Barlow gripped the edge of the table, fighting for control. Don't be silly, boy, he said finally, his voice tight. You're no rocket, man. You don't know what you're saying. His hands trembled. Space is no place for a fellow like you. You belong here, studying, working, not hopping around space like a common tramp. He tamped tobacco into his pipe bowl with an air of finality. Every boy nowadays thinks about going to space, I know. The fleets are growing larger, taking more and more boys, but the smart ones stay home. Tad's voice was low and quiet, more deadly firm than George had ever heard it. You don't understand, Dad. I know you don't like it. I know you think it's foolish not to finish college. You hate to see me leave home. But you don't understand. He looked up, his boyish face pale under deep summer tan. I can't explain it, Dad. Ever since I was little, since I saw my first rocket shooting up into the sky toward the stars, I knew I had to go too, sometime. He shook his head helplessly. It's what I've wanted all my life, Dad. I've got to go. But the farm, son? Florence was almost in tears. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Your family's been here for 100 years, Tad. It's yours as soon as you're ready to farm it. Don't you care about it after all these years? You know I care, Mom. The boy avoided her tearful eyes, ran a hand through his hair. You know I like the place. And I feel awful running out after all the work you and Dad and the men have put in, building it up. But I couldn't make a go of it. I don't want to be earthbound, tied down to a piece of land all my life. His mother's face was suddenly very, very tired. Oh, you fool, she said, her voice bitter. You don't know how you'll long for green grass again. Her face flared red in anger. You've barely started to shave, and you want to go to space. Well, it's nonsense. You can't do it. That's final. Tell him, George. Tell him why he can't go. Tell him why. Florence! She stopped short, eyes wide. George, I'm sorry. His voice was sharp, urgent. I think maybe Tad and I ought to talk this out. Ourselves. I'm sorry, George. Florence Barlow rose silently. She began clearing the table, her eyes brimming. Tad's face was troubled. I wish you wouldn't make a fuss, Dad. I suppose it's a surprise to you both. George smiled sourly. Hardly. We've been around a while, Tad. We saw Len Cooper go and a half-dozen like him. We knew you'd get the bug sooner or later, but you've got to understand why we can't allow it. The room was silent, except for the faint rustling of the breeze through the curtains. You don't know what you're walking into, Tad. None of you boys really know. You only see one side of the picture, the excitement and adventure. I know, it's a thrilling picture, but the thrill wears off, and then you have the long, dull days of waiting, sitting, always waiting, with nothing to see but the bulkhead and a dozen men cramped into impossible tight quarters without any room to move around. You don't know how you'd get to hate those men, how you'd wish you could be alone for just a little while, how you'd long for privacy. And you don't realize the danger, Not the exciting bravado kind of danger that you read about, but the live, horrible danger of depending for your life on a little sliver of metal. So many things can go wrong, and any one of them means you're through. Not a brave death, son, nor a heroic death, just a very lonely death, where you freeze and starve and feel the life choke out of you. There are so many ways to die in space. Such horrible ways, so easily. And there isn't any reward worth the risk. It's all risk, and you have nothing for it. A few days of glory when you're back home, and then you're off again. Once you go, you're gone. You'll never come back. Only the lucky ones come back. You'll be in space till it kills you. But the colonies, Dad. Mars Mountain, Players Folly, Ironstone. They're all going concerns. They need men, lots of men with ideas. Men who aren't afraid of work. The colonies? George Barlow's voice rose angrily, his control wearing thin. Why the colonies? What glory can you see in working a lifetime to squeeze a living out of Mars rock? Scraping and fighting, squeezing every last drop of water, every possible inch of topsoil to dig up enough to keep barely alive? And then dying 30 years before your time? What can you see in that? Or Venus, where you sweat and waste away until the fungus gets into your lungs and blood, and you finally just go to sleep forever. You're crazy, Tad. You can't do it. Tad shuffled his feet, his eyes downcast. I knew you wouldn't understand. I can't explain it, Dad. I don't know the words. But I've got to go, even if you don't. George's face flushed in exasperation. Now look, just listen a minute. I understand perfectly. You don't understand! The boy's eyes blazed in sudden anger. His voice was bitter. How could you understand? You've been nothing but a slogging dirt farmer all your life. How could you understand why I'd want to go to the stars? What do you know about Mars or Venus? You've never been there! George Barlow sat stiff, as though he had been struck. The room was tense, and he heard the boy breathing across the room. Then you give me no choice, he said finally, his voice suddenly tired and barely audible. I'm your father. I forbid you to go. There was a long, silent moment. Then, I'm sorry, Dad. I'm going anyway. George Barlow lay in bed, breathing quietly. The room was close, the air stuffy and humid. He heard his wife's steady breathing, peaceful now, after sobbing herself to sleep. And somehow, deep within him, he seemed to hear the steady pum, pum, pum of spaceship engines. Deep, throaty, thrilling, throbbing, vibrating, calling. He rose quietly and walked to the window. He heard Snuffy stir herself, her claws scrabbling on the bare farmhouse floor, and felt her warm muzzle, firm and comforting in his hand. Then he heard nothing but the buzzing of cicadas, the quiet night sounds of the farm, smelled the cool, hearty odor of hay and clover, heard the occasional uneasy stomping of cattle in the barn. And still, deep in his mind, he heard older sounds, more familiar sounds, sounds tinged with fear, horror, hate, desperation. He shook his head, trying to forget, but there was excitement there too, that intangible, overpowering thrill of the Wanderlust. Memories flooded back into his mind, memories he had thought long ago blotted out and forgotten. The rich thrill of excitement as the last seconds crowded in close, with the strap cutting a deep welt across his chest. The muffled roar, the powerful sledgehammer blow, driving his stomach and legs down like lead, then easing gently into no pressure, then less than no pressure. The exhilarating, wonder-filled vision of the earth rushing away, dwindling into a mottled patchwork, still dwindling. Oh, he understood all right. He knew what tugged at his son's heels. He knew the consuming thrill, the insatiable hunger to reach higher and higher, to seek out unknown places. He knew the wonder of stepping on another land, an alien land, the thrill of watching two moons creep softly over a reddish horizon. He knew the deep, rich thrill of pushing the frontier outward until the sun winked coldly like another star. Memories flooded his mind, and he remembered too well the insistent tug of the Wanderlust at his heels, the call of the open road, the call of space. And he knew that, try as he would, no earthbound answer would ever drive it away. Yes, he understood. But deep in his heart he felt the coldness, the pain and agony, the sense of bitter loss. He was one of the lucky. He had come back. Tad would never come back. The odds were too great. There were too few of the lucky. And it was better not to be one of the lucky. Better to die out there, forgotten, unmourned. Maybe he should have told the boy while he was young, tried to teach him, to make him understand. Perhaps he'd been wrong to conceal it all these years, to lie to Tad, to make Florence conceal too. Perhaps Tad should have been told. But even knowing that someday the Wanderlust would come, he knew he couldn't have told him. Better to conceal, to wait for the contempt. Wait to hear the words, short, bitter words. How could you ever understand? You've never been there. George felt the perspiration trickle down his neck. How could he explain the things he hardly dared think about himself? The fear, the bitterness, the horror. Tad would be sleeping now, peacefully in his room, his bag half packed on the dresser, dreaming dreams of wonder in his sleep, and never dreaming for an instant of the terror, the pain, never knowing how hard a taskmaster the Wanderlust could be, what terrible fees it could exact. He knew he couldn't fight it. He had known since Tad was born that it would be useless, for the young saw only what they wanted to see. And suddenly George was fumbling in his dresser drawer, frantically searching for the small oblong box, rushing before he changed his mind. His hands closed on the small container, and its contents were cold between his fingers. And then he was in Tad's room, quietly, seeking the bag half packed, a few meager clothes, a few meager memories to go away with a hopeful heart. He fumbled in the bag, and suddenly the memories closed in on George Barlow, and he was living again the horrible moments, the rumbling, jolting thunder in the bowels of the ship, the frantic scrambling down the dark passageways, the men fear-crazed and tumbling over each other in freefall, the gleaming white-hot of the atomic fires gone wild, the screams of agony, the crashing, fiery groping through oven-like chambers, the twisting, wrenching of controls, fighting to stay alive, fighting in blazing agony, fire burning to the bottom of his soul. The little metal disc slipped into the boy's bag, down between a pair of pants and a book. A thin metal disc of pure gold, a simple symbol with simple words. To George L. Barlow, for heroism in space. He dropped the disc into the boy's bag and stumbled back to his room. He sat in the silence, stroking old Snuffy's soft muzzle. Sat in darkness, eternal since that hour of terror, as tears streamed down scarred cheeks from his sightless eyes. End of Wanderlust by Alan E. Norse.